Hello and welcome to this ETOA Snapshot on hosting events for destinations. We're going to look at elements to consider, maximising the positive impacts and managing some of the challenges that come along with hosting these things. I'm joined as ever by our tourism stats expert, David Edwards. So welcome to you, David. And let's kick off by what sorts of events are we talking about here?
So events clearly come in all shapes and sizes, Rachel. We've got those which we might term mega events, such as perhaps the FIFA World Cup or Olympic Games, and sometimes those are, and increasingly so, hosted in destinations that have actively sought out that event and perhaps see this as an opportunity to really grow awareness of that destination, and there will then be lots of associated creation of supply, whether that's hotels or wider infrastructure. But of course, there are very many what we might term routine events, whether that's ongoing sporting events that happen on an annual basis or festivals such as the Edinburgh Festival up in Scotland, which are smaller in scale in many ways and fit within a regular calendar. Now, I think it's fair to say that very often the impact of events on tourism tends to be rather polarized. Either events are good for tourism or events are seen as bad for tourism. But of course, the world is a lot more nuanced than that. And events are multidimensional in relation to the objectives that might have been set for them and the impacts that they have. And were we living in an ideal world, these would be measured and evaluated from a neutral standpoint. So what are some of the types of impacts and objectives that might be associated with an event being hosted in a destination? Well, we can think about attendance. So how many visitors came to attend events? What was the profile? Were they overnight stayers or were they day trippers? We can think, and we always do, about the economic impact, and that can be the direct, the indirect, and the induced. So here we're thinking about, well, what might visitors have spent in the locality? On what types of goods and services was that spending? Might we have seen spending abstracted from one type of economic activity to another? Then we've got the environmental impacts associated with an event. So what was the level of waste created? What level of resource was used? What form of transport did those organising and attending the event use to get to the destination? Was there provenance, local provenance for the food and drink consumed? And broadly, would we say this was a sustainable event for the destination? Then there's a social aspect to think about. So were those attending the event satisfied with their experience? What might it have done in relation to destination identity and image? Has it enticed locals and others to participate in various forms of activity or to volunteer? And then last but certainly not least, we can think about the media impacts from an event. So what level of coverage was there? What was the level of media engagement? What was the tone of voice? Was it positive or negative or neutral? And can we assign a value to the coverage that hosting an event might have created for a destination? Thinking then about the impact on visitor experience of events, well, this will depend on the degree to which an event was the motivation for the trip, the degree to which the event impacts other features within the trip, so the costs of the trip, the availability of accommodation, the level of crowding, those sorts of things. And if it had not been a motivator, whether nonetheless it has a positive serendipitous impact on the overall visitor experience. Now, we very often don't think as much as perhaps we should about whether or not events suit the destination in which they are taking place. Now, the words localism and authenticity are often cited as being positively correlated with visitor experience. As such, events that genuinely reflect the place in which they are taking place may enhance destination advocacy rather more so than what we might term generic events. So playing host to a touring event might be welcomed as much by local residents as it is by visitors or the wider visitor economy within a destination. And then let's think about industry impacts. Well, businesses will typically welcome anything that will bolster demand, but events may, of course, divert visitor spending away from some types of activities towards the event. So this abstraction idea. Now, a spike in demand for an event such as a one-off concert might negatively impact demand in the days before and after if it ends up dissuading those who were minded to stay in the destination for rather more days from doing so, because they can see, oh, look, prices are really high during the period when I'm looking to stay in the destination. So let's have 3 points to ponder for our short discussion. The first of these is it the case that while small-scale events rarely have the means to measure their impacts effectively, larger scale event organisers might be overly focused on self-promotion of their event? Second of the 3 points, would locals, visitors, and the tourism industry more widely benefit from greater event planning coordination at a destination level? And last but certainly not least, rather than the objective being simply to host an event, ought there be greater emphasis on clear objectives for what an event will deliver for tourism, with proper measurement and reporting as to whether or not the outcomes being sought end up being delivered? So, Rachel, thoughts on events?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. In fact, just picking up on your first point there about not having the means to measure impacts effectively. I don't think that's actually just to do with small scale events. I think you can even find that with large scale events, because what we tend to see is that once one is finished, everybody moves on to the next one because one's done and dusted, and there's perhaps not a requirement on their side to go back and have a look and how was that, longer term, and what were maybe some of the potential downsides. So, I think it's not necessarily about the small ones. It's perhaps about the mindset of on to the next thing, as it were. And I think it's certainly fair to say that often people are only looking at these impacts if there's some kind of a challenge. Mm-hmm. So if the event is there and everybody's welcome, it just goes ahead and there we are. It's only really if there is a sort of implication on, say, for example, we found with the Olympics, there was a discussion around whether tourism ought to pay more in terms of tax because it was a beneficiary. And then there was a look at, is it actually a beneficiary, and can we measure these things? So I would say that is probably applicable across most sizes of events. But I think I really wanted to pick up on your point, this with regards to impact, is it's really a balancing act for destinations between the big spike in short-term visitors against potentially driving away longer term and possibly higher spend visitors. That's a very difficult thing to know ahead of time, isn't it?
It is, and it will very much depend on, well, it will depend on many things, but including what's the longevity of the event that's taking place, and to what extent will the person who is coming purely to attend the event be exposed to the other elements of the destination. So clearly, if they are literally just spending every waking moment at an event, they might interact rather less with the destination than if they are dipping into and out of an event. And as such, if what we're wanting is for people to go to a place when they're attending an event and want to return back to that place, regardless of whether or not an event is taking place, it's really important to try and find ways of ensuring that people do get proper exposure to what else a destination is offering by way of food and drink, attractions and experiences. So I think it's a really challenging one for a destination to find those events that properly fit with what it is that they're offering.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there you've also touched on the introduction element of it. So, when a destination is looking at the benefits, is it that if somebody comes to an event that's fairly relevant to the destination as an introduction, they then return having had the destination having had a chance to showcase itself at the event?
Indeed, and it's got that more synergistic element to it. So, for example, if it's perhaps about food provenance from an area, then that's really sort of ticking all the boxes, if you like, of making it feel authentic to visitors and giving them a genuine taste, if you like, of what's on offer there. Whereas if it's literally a traveling type of event that has no provenance from the place that it is visiting, then why would you think, oh yes, look, I went to place X for that event, I'm going to go back there again in the future?
Indeed. And actually, just thinking about that, more to your third point here about ways of measuring at what things deliver for tourism. I would say perhaps the reason there isn't greater emphasis on it is because we don't really have a framework for doing that. Do you think we'll ever get to a place where that is there? And it will be easily accessible for people, like some kind of a toolkit, perhaps?
I think so one of the slides where I looked at those different dimensions was taken from the Events Impact Toolkit that Sports England had produced a number of years ago, which is a fabulous resource. I think it is underutilized, partly perhaps because destinations and event organizers aren't necessarily aware of it being there. And it allows you to go from really small scale event up to a much bigger event in terms of what is suitable with regard to evaluation. But some of this comes down to event organizers and destinations truly wanting to unpick all of the positives and potentially all of the negative impacts that will flow from hosting an event. There is always a risk that we go back to that first slide that I looked at of, oh, it's good or it's bad, and perhaps they're being less focused on saying, let's properly understand what this is doing for the visitor economy, for local residents, for the visitor experience, and then figure out how can we make it even better next time collectively, rather than just simply chasing events for the sake of thinking, oh yes, look, lots of other destinations have got events, we should have one too.
Absolutely, David. Now, I'm aware that this is effectively a snapshot that we're covering here. This is obviously a much bigger topic, and I think we may need a full-scale webinar on this one, David. But for now, we will need to leave it there. And a reminder that you can find lots of research and insight reports, etc., most of them summarised by David, on etoa.org/insight at the Insight Hub. And thank you very much for joining me today, David, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.